You think you see people. You think you see the world for what it is. You see the man in the hand-stitched Brioni suit, barking orders into a phone that costs more than your car. And you see power. You see the woman in a crisp uniform, refilling your water glass with a practiced silent grace, and you see nothing. You see a function, a pair of hands, a ghost in the machine of your evening. You are wrong. Real power isn't in the volume of a voice, but in the precision of an eye. It's the quiet, unnerving ability to see the single, misplaced brushstroke in a masterpiece of deceit, a flaw that 11 of the most ruthless litigators in Chicago missed while they were too busy admiring the reflection of their own $1,000 haircuts in the polished mahogany. Ilara Vance was a waitress at the Obsidian, and she was an expert at being nothing. At 24, she had mastered the art of becoming part of the scenery. She poured wine that cost more per bottle than her monthly rent. She cleared plates bearing the remnants of meals that could feed her family for a week. She was invisible. And in the gilded cage of the Obsidian, invisibility was a superpower. Last Thursday, that superpower didn't just save a man's legacy, it dismantled a lie decades in the making. It saved an empire built on steel and sweat from being stolen by a phantom signature. And what the empire's patriarch did next was a lesson to every soul in that room. The most dangerous person is never the one who shouts, but the one who truly sees. The Obsidian wasn't merely a restaurant, it was the unofficial boardroom of Chicago's elite. Carved out of the ground floor of a historic skyscraper, its dark wood walls seemed to drink the light, its plush velvet booths designed to swallow secrets. The air was a rich tapestry, woven from the scents of dry-aged steak, rare bourbon, and the faint metallic tang of generational wealth. To work there, you didn't just need to know the vintage of a Chateau Margaux. You needed to know when to materialize and when to evaporate. Ilara was a master of evaporation. To the titans of industry and their trophy wives, she was a polite murmur, a "pardon me, sir," or, more often than not, just the silent anticipation of a need. They didn't know she spent her nights not in bars with people her age, but hunched over a drawing table in a cramped studio apartment, charcoal dust permanently embedded under her fingernails. They didn't know she'd had a full scholarship to the Art Institute of Chicago, a prodigy in portraiture, until her father's lungs, scarred and weakened from 30 years in an Illinois coal mine, had finally given out, tethering him to an oxygen tank and a mountain of medical debt. She had traded her canvases for serving trays, her charcoal sticks for a corkscrew, to pay for the very air he breathed. They saw the apron, not the artist. And most nights, that was a mercy. Being invisible allowed her to observe. Her artist's training hadn't just taught her about light and shadow. It had taught her to see the architecture of a face, the subtle tension in a jawline that betrayed a forced smile, the weary slump of shoulders on a man pretending to be invincible. She didn't just see people, she deconstructed them. "Table 7 is yours, Ilara," Carlos, the maitre d', whispered, his normally unflappable demeanor showing cracks. His face was ashen. "It's the Sterling party." A cold knot formed in Ilara's stomach. Arthur Sterling, the founder and CEO of Sterling Innovations, a manufacturing behemoth he had built from a single machine shop in the 1960s. The man was a Chicago institution, a relic from an era of handshake deals and American-made steel, but the whispers in the financial pages weren't about his past triumphs. They were about the circling vulture. Julian Croft, a ruthless tech billionaire who was orchestrating a hostile takeover. Croft wasn't just a rival. He was Sterling's former protégé, a betrayal that made the corporate battle deeply, bitterly personal. "Is he with Mr. Croft?" Ilara asked, her hands automatically checking the alignment of the salt and pepper shakers on her station. "Worse," Carlos said, running a hand over his slicked back hair. "He's with his lawyers, all of them. Kensington, Black and Reed. They've booked the founder's room. They look like they're attending a funeral." He leaned closer. "The word is, Croft has him. Some kind of poison pill in the original company charter. Today is the day Sterling signs it all away." Ilara nodded, her face a practiced mask of neutrality. "I'll take care of them." She moved through the main dining room, a heavy silver tray laden with iced water goblets balanced on one shoulder. Her steps were silent and sure, weaving through the cacophony of clinking glasses and boisterous laughter like a phantom. When she pushed open the massive soundproofed oak door of the founder's room, the silence that greeted her was more deafening than the noise outside. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with the scent of defeat and expensive cologne. Arthur Sterling sat at the head of the immense table, looking every one of his 78 years. The formidable titan she'd seen in magazines was gone, replaced by a man shrunken by despair. His silver hair, usually impeccably combed, was in disarray. His tie was loosened, and his eyes, the color of a stormy lake, were fixed on a document in the center of the table as if it were a venomous snake. He looked like a king watching his kingdom being dismantled stone by stone. Flanking him were the lawyers, 11 of them. The best, the most expensive, the most merciless legal minds in the Midwest. They were a sea of gray and navy suits, their faces a mixture of practiced solemnity and barely concealed impatience. Their leader was Marcus Thorne, a senior partner with a face like a clenched fist and a reputation for surgically dismantling his opponents on the witness stand. Thorne was pacing, his polished Oxfords making no sound on the thick Persian rug. "And that is the final nail, Arthur," he was saying, his voice a smooth, condescending baritone. "The codicil is unambiguous. Eleanor's signature gives Croft the right to invoke the succession clause. We've had 3 different document examiners look at the scan. It's her signature. It's ironclad." Ilara began her silent ritual, placing a water goblet beside each man. Not a single one acknowledged her presence. She was less than furniture. She was an absence. She would never have signed that. Sterling's voice was a low, ragged whisper, laced with a grief that felt far older than this corporate battle. Eleanor loved this company. It was our child. She would have burned it to the ground before letting a parasite like Croft get his hands on it. Thorne stopped pacing and placed his hands on the table, leaning toward Sterling. The gesture was meant to look supportive, but it was predatory. "Arthur, with all due respect, Eleanor signed this in 1995. You were expanding into Asia. The company was leveraged. This codicil was a safety measure, an insurance policy. She probably forgot she even signed it. We've been over this. For 48 hours, 11 of us have torn this thing apart. If there was a way out, we would have found it." Ilara moved to pour water into Thorne's glass. He gestured impatiently for her to wait, not even gracing her with a glance. He was focused solely on his client, the picture of weary competence. "So I'm just supposed to surrender?" Sterling asked, the fight draining from him, leaving behind a brittle shell. 30 years of my life, my wife's legacy, handed over because of a piece of paper I've never seen? "It's not surrender, Arthur. It's acceptance of the facts," Thorne said, finally nodding for Ilara to pour his water. He checked his Patek Philippe, a watch that could have paid for her father's medical care for a year. "Croft's offer expires at midnight. If you don't sign, he takes this to the board tomorrow, armed with this codicil, and they'll oust you for breach of your fiduciary duty. This way, you walk away with a sizable settlement. You can retire. Play golf." The condescension was a physical thing in the room. They were humoring a broken old man. They wanted their billable hours to end. Ilara continued her silent circuit of the table. The meal service was a somber affair. Undisturbed salads, barely touched entrees, wine glasses refilled but not emptied. The room was a tomb of paperwork. Legal briefs, financial reports, and binders of documents were piled high. As she cleared a bread plate near Arthur Sterling, her eyes fell upon the source of all this misery. It wasn't the original document, but a high-resolution, full-color printout of it, lying next to Sterling's trembling hand. The lawyers were all referencing the same image on their tablets. The codicil to the Sterling Innovations Founding Charter, dated October 17th, 1995. The paper was digitally aged to show the yellowing of the original. The text was from an old electric typewriter, but it was the signature at the bottom that held all the power. Eleanor Vance Sterling. It was a beautiful signature, elegant and looping. Ilara had seen it once before on the brass plaque of a university arts building Eleanor had endowed. She paused for a fraction of a second, the weight of a stack of porcelain plates grounding her. Her artist's eye, the part of her brain that saw the world in lines and pressure and form, snagged on something. It was like hearing a single note played out of tune in a symphony. The other lawyers were droning on about exit strategies and non-disclosure agreements. They saw the signature as a legal fact, a data point. Ilara saw something else. She saw the lines. "More coffee, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice a soft intrusion. "Whatever." He waved her off, his attention on his tablet. "Arthur, we have the settlement papers ready. You just need to sign." Ilara poured the coffee, her gaze fixed on the signature on the printout. It was perfect. Too perfect. A signature, a real one, practiced over a lifetime, has a certain rhythm. It has speed. There are places where the pressure of the pen is heavy and deliberate, and places where it's light and fast, the pen almost skipping across the paper. It has life. This signature, this one was drawn. She could see it. The pressure was too uniform, the speed too consistent. There were no natural variations. The elegant loops weren't formed by a confident, fluid motion, but by a careful, meticulous hand, drawing the shape of a signature. It was a masterful copy, a technical marvel, but it was dead. It had no soul, no history. It was a beautiful, intricate forgery. Her heart began to beat a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the faces of the 11 lawyers. They were experts in law, in loopholes and clauses. They weren't experts in the art of the human hand. They wouldn't see it. They were legally blind. She looked at Arthur Sterling. He was a man being haunted by a ghost, forced to betray his own wife's memory. He was being told her hand, her own signature, was the weapon that would destroy him. The injustice of it was a physical ache in Ilara's chest. She was a waitress, a nobody. Speaking up would be professional suicide. Carlos would fire her before she finished her sentence. These men would have her blacklisted from every restaurant in the city. They would laugh at her. But she thought of her father, a man of quiet integrity who had worked in darkness his whole life only to be betrayed by his own body. She thought of the charcoal on her fingers, the one thing in her life that felt true and honest. She couldn't stay silent. She couldn't let a lie drawn in ink destroy a life built in steel. Thorne slid a leather-bound folder in front of Arthur. "The settlement, Arthur. Sign it. It's time to let go." Sterling picked up a heavy, gold-nibbed fountain pen. A pen he'd probably used his entire career. His hand shook violently. He looked at the 11 lawyers, all nodding at him like a Greek chorus of doom. I suppose there's no other choice," he whispered, his voice cracking. He uncapped the pen. The nib hovered over the signature line. "Don't." The word was quiet, but it sliced through the funereal atmosphere of the room like a shard of glass. The silence that followed was absolute, a perfect vacuum. Arthur Sterling froze, the pen a millimetre from the page. 12 heads, a collective of wealth and power, swiveled slowly towards her. Marcus Thorne looked at her as if a lamp had just offered a legal opinion. His eyes, cold and grey, scanned her black uniform, her apron, the coffee pot still clutched in her hand. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice dangerously soft, laced with ice. Elara's own hands were trembling so hard she thought the pot would rattle. She gripped it tighter, the heat a small, grounding pain. "Don't sign it, Mr. Sterling," she repeated, her voice finding a sliver of strength. "The codicil, the signature, it's a forgery." Thorne let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It was a sound of pure, incredulous contempt. He looked around at his team, a smirk playing on his lips. "Is this some kind of prank? Carlos, get in here and control your stuff." "I'm not joking," Elara said, taking a half step forward. The movement felt monumental. "And I'm not a document expert. I'm an artist. I look at lines all day. That signature, it wasn't written. It was drawn." Thorne's face was beginning to flush a deep, angry red. He stood to his full height, attempting to intimidate her with his physical presence. "Young lady, do you have any idea what you are talking about? We are discussing a 10-figure acquisition. We have had this document authenticated by the best in the business. We do not require a critique from the catering staff. Now, get out of this room before I have you thrown out." But Arthur Sterling hadn't moved. He hadn't looked away from her. Amid the shock and outrage, he was the only one who was truly listening. He saw the terror in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw an unnerving certainty. He had built his empire by trusting his gut, and his gut was telling him the most honest person in this room was the one holding the coffee pot. "Wait," Sterling said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the old weight of command. "Arthur, for God's sake," Thorne groaned, rolling his eyes at the ceiling. "She's a waitress. She wants a story to tell her friends, or maybe a bigger tip." "I said, wait," Sterling commanded again. The steel was back in his voice. He placed the pen down carefully. He didn't look at the document. He looked at Elara. "Explain." All eyes were on her. She swallowed, her throat dry. A person's signature is fluid. It's muscle memory. It's fast. The pressure on the pen changes. You can see the speed in the lines. Some parts are thicker, where the hand pauses, and some are thinner, where it moves quickly. She pointed a trembling finger at the printout. That signature has no variation. The line weight is almost perfectly uniform. That happens when you trace something slowly and carefully. It's a drawing of a signature, not a signature itself. It has no life in it. It's a ghost. The room was silent. The lawyers exchanged glances, a mixture of annoyance and confusion. What she was saying was artistic jargon, not legal precedent. "This is insane," Thorne sputtered. "It's subjective nonsense." "Is it?" Sterling asked softly. He picked up the printout. He stared at his wife's name. He had watched her sign that name thousands of times. On birthday cards, on checks, on the mortgage for their first home. He had never thought about line weight or pressure, but he knew the feel of it. He knew the confident flourish at the end of the N. Looking at it now, through this girl's eyes, he saw it. The perfect, lifeless quality of it. It was like looking at a wax replica of his wife. It looked like her, but it was cold and dead. He looked up, not at Thorne, but at the youngest lawyer at the end of the table, a nervous-looking associate named Peterson. "Peterson, you were in charge of the authentication reports. Who did you use?" Digital Forensics Inc., sir, Peterson stammered. Their industry standard. They ran a pixel analysis on the high-resolution scan Croft provided. They said it was consistent with other known examples of Mrs. Sterling's signature. Consistent, Ilara said, emboldened. A good forgery is consistent, but is it alive? Did they analyze the pressure, the speed, or did they just compare the shapes? That's not what their software does, Peterson admitted quietly. Sterling slowly stood up. He seemed to grow taller, the stooped, defeated man replaced by the titan he once was. The storm was back in his eyes. He looked at Marcus Thorne, who was now staring at the signature with a flicker of dawning horror. "You told me it was ironclad," Sterling said, his voice dangerously calm. "Arthur, the experts," Thorne began, his bluster failing him. "You and 10 of your colleagues," Sterling continued, his voice rising with each word, "charged me over $200,000 for 2 days of work to tell me to give up, to betray my wife's memory based on a ghost drawn by a goddamn machine." He slammed his hand on the table, the force of it making the water glasses jump. And a 24-year-old girl with a coffee pot saw the truth in 5 minutes. He turned to Ilara. The fury in his eyes softened into something else, awe, respect, and a profound, desperate hope. "What's your name, son?" "It's Ilara, sir," she whispered. "Ilara Vance." "Ilara Vance," Sterling repeated, the name a vow. He turned back to his legal team, his face a mask of cold fury. "You are all fired. Pack your expensive briefcases and get out of my building. If I see any of your names on an invoice, I will personally sue your firm into oblivion for malpractice and gross negligence." The room exploded into chaos. The lawyers, stunned and indignant, began scrambling to gather their belongings, muttering about insanity and professional liability. Marcus Thorne stood frozen for a moment, his face a mottled canvas of rage and humiliation. He shot Ilara a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, a look that promised retribution. Then he turned and stormed out, his team scurrying in his wake. When the heavy oak door clicked shut, the silence that returned was different. It was clean. It was hopeful. It was just Ilara and Arthur Sterling in the quiet, cavernous room. He sank back into his chair, the energy leaving him in a long, shuddering exhale. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The cheap but clean uniform. The faint charcoal smudge on her right thumb she must have missed. The exhaustion and fierce intelligence in her young eyes. "You're not just a waitress, are you, Ilara Vance?" "I am tonight, sir," she said, her voice still shaky. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair Marcus Thorne had just vacated. "I can't, sir. I have to clear the table. The dinner service—" "I will buy this restaurant and turn it into a parking lot if I have to," Sterling said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Sit. Down." Ilara sat. The expensive leather was still warm. It felt like sitting on a throne she had no right to occupy. "Carlos," Sterling called out, his voice booming towards the door. The maitre d' appeared instantly, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. "Yes, Mr. Sterling?" "Lock the main doors. Send all the other patrons home. Their meals are on me. Send my compliments to the chef and tell him to go home, too." "Send everyone home," Sterling commanded, "except for us. Miss Vance and I have work to do. And bring us the oldest bottle of scotch you have in the cellar. The really old stuff. We're declaring war." For the next 8 hours, the founder's room at the Obsidian was transformed. The remnants of the disastrous meal were pushed to one end of the table, replaced by a battlefield of paper. With the scotch poured into heavy crystal tumblers, an unlikely alliance was forged between the 78-year-old industrialist and the 24-year-old artist. The vast chasm of age, wealth, and status that separated them vanished, replaced by a singular, shared purpose: to unmask a lie. "Tell me everything," Arthur said, his voice raspy with fatigue but sharp with focus. "Not the art school nonsense. Tell me what you really see." Elara, now seated opposite him, took a sip of the scotch. It burned a warm, steadying path down her throat. The initial terror had receded, replaced by the familiar, exhilarating hum of a problem to be solved. It felt like stretching a muscle she'd been forced to let atrophy for 2 long years. "It's about intention," she began, leaning forward. "When you sign your name, you're not thinking about the letters. It's a single, unified gesture. It's like a dance you've done 1,000 times. A forger can't replicate the dance. They can only replicate the positions. They have to think about every curve, every connection. That hesitation, no matter how microscopic, shows up in the line. It's a tremor, a lack of confidence." She took a napkin and a pen from the table. "Look." She scribbled her own name quickly. "See? The line is dynamic. It breathes." Then she slowly, carefully, tried to copy it. "Now look at this one. It's stiff. It's a corpse." Arthur stared at the 2 signatures on the napkin. For the first time, he understood. "A ghost," he whispered, echoing her earlier word. "He's trying to haunt me with a ghost." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a new, raw pain. "But how do we prove it? Croft is smart. He wouldn't have used a simple forgery. He must have a story, a way to make it stick." "He has the original document," Elara reasoned, her mind clicking into gear. "The scan is all we've seen. The real proof, the indentation of the pen, the texture of the ink, it's all on that piece of paper. We need it." It would have been filed with the corporate registrar's office in Springfield, Arthur mused. But it would be under seal. Only a court order could unseal it, and Thorne and his army of idiots are the ones who would have to file the motion. "The army you just fired," Elara finished. He nodded grimly. "We're alone in this." He fell silent for a moment, swirling the scotch in his glass. "No, not entirely." He pulled out an old, worn leather phone book from his briefcase, a relic from another era. He flipped through the pages. "There's a man, Frank Ziegler. Used to be the top questioned documents examiner for the FBI. Retired about 10 years ago. Lives in a cabin in Wisconsin now. Mostly just fishes and yells at squirrels. If anyone can see what you see and translate it into language a judge will understand, it's Frank." While Arthur made the call, waking the grumpy forensics expert from a deep sleep, Elara's mind was racing elsewhere. "The lawyers," she said as soon as he hung up. "Thorne and his team. They aren't just incompetent. They're incurious. Why didn't they question it harder? Why were they so eager for you to sign?" "Thorne and I have history," Arthur admitted, his face darkening. "I blocked his appointment to the board of the City Museum years ago. Said he had the artistic sensibility of a brick. He's never forgiven me. He wasn't trying to save me. He was enjoying watching me fall." He paused. "But what about Croft? How could he be so sure this would work? How did he even get a perfect copy of Eleanor's signature to trace?" Elara's blood ran cold. She thought back to the stories she'd heard about Julian Croft. He had started at Sterling Innovations right out of college. Arthur had treated him like a son. He had been a frequent guest at their home. He would have had access. "Charity galas," she said suddenly. "Donation checks, signed letters. Your wife was a major philanthropist. Her signature would be on dozens of documents, many of them public." Arthur's face hardened into a mask of stone. The betrayal was a fresh wound. He used her charity to destroy her legacy. As the first grey hints of dawn began to bleed into the Chicago sky, they had the beginnings of a strategy. It was a fragile, desperate plan, hinging on a retired FBI agent, a locked document vault in the state capitol, and the artistic intuition of a waitress. But for the first time in days, Arthur Sterling felt a flicker of hope. They had overlooked one crucial element. A man like Marcus Thorne, a man whose ego was as vast and brittle as a cathedral of glass, does not simply accept defeat. Humiliation festers into venom. While Arthur and Elara were plotting their defense, Thorne was planning his revenge. At 7 a.m., in a sleek, minimalist office overlooking Millennium Park, Marcus Thorne sat opposite Julian Croft. Croft was everything Arthur Sterling was not. Young, predatory, radiating a restless energy. He wore a simple black t-shirt that probably cost more than Thorne's suit. He listened without expression as Thorne recounted the events of the previous night. When Thorne finished, Croft was silent for a long time. "A waitress," he said finally, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "You let my entire strategy, a strategy 2 years in the making, get derailed by a waitress." "She got lucky," Thorne insisted, sweat beading on his upper lip. "It was a fluke, a 1 in a million guess. Sterling is acting on emotion, not logic. He has no legal counsel. He's vulnerable." "Who is she?" Croft asked, his eyes like chips of ice. "Her name is Elara Vance," Thorne said, consulting a file his team had hastily assembled overnight. 24. Art school dropout. Father is a disabled coal miner from downstate. She's buried in his medical debt. She's waiting tables to keep his oxygen tank filled. She's nobody. A slow, cold smile spread across Julian Croft's face. "No, Marcus. She's not nobody. She's leverage." He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city below. Desperate people do desperate things. If she's the one advising Sterling, then we stop attacking the document and we start attacking the advisor. "What do you have in mind?" Thorne asked, leaning forward eagerly. "We can't let this go to a formal discovery process. That old man Ziegler will prove it's a forgery in a heartbeat," Croft said. "We have to end this now. We're going to leak a story. Not about the codicil, but about Sterling's new advisor. We paint a picture of a senile old man, grieving his wife, being manipulated by a young, desperate and indebted girl. We suggest she's coercing him, taking advantage of his fragile mental state for a payday." Thorne's eyes lit up with malicious understanding. "We can destroy her credibility. We can file for an emergency conservatorship over Arthur, claiming he's no longer fit to run the company. The board will panic. The shareholders will revolt. They'll hand the company over to you just to stabilize the situation." "Exactly," Croft said, turning from the window. "And I want you to dig deeper into her life. Every unpaid bill, every late rent payment, every single hardship. We're going to make her life so public, so miserable, that she'll either flee or take a payoff to disappear. We're going to bury her." Back at the Obsidian, Elara had no idea the storm clouds were gathering. She was operating on a potent cocktail of adrenaline, caffeine, and a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since she'd packed away her art supplies. Arthur had insisted she go home to shower and change, telling her to meet him at the Sterling Innovations headquarters in 2 hours. When she walked into the soaring marble lobby of the Sterling Tower, she felt like an ant in a palace of giants. The air itself seemed to hum with power. A stern-faced security guard at the main desk stopped her before she'd taken 3 steps. "Can I help you, miss?" His tone was dismissive, his eyes cataloguing her cheap blazer and worn-out flats. "I'm here to see Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice sounding small in the cavernous space. "Name?" "Ilara Vance." The guard's expression didn't change, but his fingers, which had been tapping idly, froze over his keyboard. He typed in her name. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He looked from his screen to her, and back again. "My apologies, Miss Vance. Mr. Sterling is expecting you. Penthouse level. The executive elevator is to your right." As the silent, wood-paneled elevator ascended, her phone buzzed. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. "We know who you are. We know about your father. Walk away from this before you ruin both your lives. Some debts can't be paid." The blood drained from her face. The threat wasn't just against her. It was against her father, the most vulnerable person in her life. She stepped out of the elevator on trembling legs and into Arthur Sterling's office. It was less an office and more a museum of a life well lived, filled with books, blueprints, and photographs of him with his late wife, Eleanor. He saw the look on her face immediately. "What is it? What's happened?" She showed him the text. He read it, his jaw tightening, until the muscles stood out in sharp relief. "Croft!" he snarled. "The coward. He can't fight me, so he goes after a girl and her sick father." "Mr. Sterling, maybe I should—" she started, her resolve crumbling. "I can't let him hurt my dad. I can go back to the restaurant. I can say I made a mistake." Arthur walked around his massive desk and stood in front of her. He looked down at her, not with pity, but with a fierce, protective anger. "He is threatening you because you are the only thing in the world he is afraid of right now. He knows you have the truth. Do you think for 1 second that if you walk away, he will just leave you alone?" Men like Croft don't show mercy. They see it as a weakness to be exploited. The only way to be safe from a bully is to knock him flat on his back. He picked up a heavy, official-looking badge from his desk. It read, "Ilara Vance, Special Consultant, Office of the CEO. You are now an employee of Sterling Innovations," he said, his voice firm. "You are under my protection. I'm moving your father to a private clinic this afternoon with a full security detail. Let Croft try to get to him now." He pressed the badge into her hand. "They want to attack the advisor. Fine. Let's give them an advisor they can't ignore." Ilara looked at the badge, its weight solid and real in her palm. For 2 years, she had been defined by her burdens. Now, for the first time, she was being defined by her strength. The fear didn't vanish, but a new feeling rose to meet it. Defiance. She clipped the badge to her blazer. "Okay," she said, her voice clear and steady. "What's our next move?" The emergency board meeting was convened for the following afternoon, a Friday. It was held in the Apex Room, a sterile, glass-walled chamber at the very top of Sterling Tower that offered a godlike 360-degree view of Chicago. The view was meant to inspire a sense of dominance and possibility, but today it just made the room feel isolated and exposed, like a fishbowl in the sky. The 12 members of the board of directors were arranged around a circular table of polished granite. They were a somber collection of the city's financial royalty, their faces etched with concern and impatience. They whispered amongst themselves, casting nervous glances at Arthur Sterling, who sat silently at his designated place, his expression unreadable. Ilara sat to his left. She wore a simple, professional dress Arthur's secretary had procured for her that morning. On the outside, she projected a calm she was nowhere near feeling. Inside, her stomach was a churning knot of anxiety. The threatening text message echoed in her mind. She felt the weight of every board member's stare, their eyes questioning her presence, judging her youth, her unfamiliarity. She was an alien in this ecosystem, an unknown variable in a world that despised them. At precisely 2:05 p.m., the double doors hissed open. Julian Croft entered, not with the swagger of a conqueror, but with an air of grave, theatrical concern. He was followed by Marcus Thorne, who carried a stack of files like a weapon. "Arthur," Croft said, his voice resonating with false sympathy. He didn't take a seat. He remained standing, addressing the entire board. "I'm glad we could all meet. I know this is difficult, but it's for the good of the company." His eyes swept over Elara, a flicker of something cold and reptilian in their depths before he masked it with pity. "I see you've made a new friend." "Get on with it, Julian," Arthur said, his voice flat. "Very well," Marcus Thorne interjected, stepping forward. He began distributing a dossier to each board member. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today because we have grave concerns for the stability of Sterling Innovations and for the mental well-being of its founder." He let the words hang in the air. The board members began flipping through the pages. Elara caught a glimpse of the cover. Psychological and financial profile. Elara Vance. "As you know," Thorne continued, his voice oozing sincerity, "we recently uncovered a codicil to the founding charter that grants Mr. Croft certain rights." Arthur was, understandably, distressed. In his fragile state, he had fallen under the influence of this young woman. He gestured toward Elara with a dismissive flick of his wrist, a motion one might use to shoo away an insect. Miss Elara Vance, a 24-year-old waitress with no business experience, no college degree, and who is, according to our research, in dire financial straits due to her father's extensive medical needs. He paused, letting the poison of his words seep into the sterile air of the apex room. The board members, sharks who smelled blood in the water, shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the dossier in their hands and Elara. They weren't seeing a person. They were seeing a liability, a narrative of desperation. "Miss Vance has convinced Arthur to reject a generous settlement offer based on a bizarre and unsubstantiated claim that a legally authenticated document is a forgery. She has done so by preying on his grief over his late wife. We believe Arthur is being manipulated by a desperate individual for financial gain. It is our sad duty to report that he is no longer capable of acting in the best interests of this company. We are therefore petitioning this board to place him on immediate medical leave and appoint Mr. Croft as interim CEO to prevent further damage." A low, dangerous murmur rippled through the room. A portly man named Henderson, the head of the audit committee, and a man known for his brutal pragmatism, cleared his throat. The sound was like gravel grinding. "Arthur, is this true? Are you really taking legal advice from this girl?" The word "girl" was laced with a thick, syrupy condescension. Arthur Sterling did not flinch. He hadn't looked at Henderson, nor at any of the other anxious faces around the granite table. His gaze, sharp and cold as a shard of ice, remained fixed on Julian Croft. "The only thing fragile in this room, Julian," he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the whispers, "is your lie." He gave a slow, deliberate nod to Elara. This was it. The precipice. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Her legs felt like hollow reeds, but she forced them to hold her as she stood. The sound of her chair sliding back on the polished floor seemed to echo in the tense silence. In that moment, she shed the skin of the waitress, the art school dropout, the frightened daughter. She was an instrument of truth, and she had been honed to a razor's edge. "Mr. Croft," she began. Her voice, to her own astonishment, was a clear, steady note in the discordant room. It did not tremble. "You claim the codicil is legitimate. You claim Mrs. Sterling signed it on October 17th, 1995. The document has been authenticated by 3 separate firms, Thorne snapped, stepping forward as if to shield his client. This is a pathetic and desperate waste of this board's valuable time. Then you won't mind a simple question, Ilara continued, her eyes never leaving Croft's. His composure was a masterpiece of control, but she could see the minute tension in the muscle along his jaw. She saw it not as a lawyer would, but as an artist would, a line under stress, threatening to break. What kind of pen did she use? The question was so unexpected, so mundane, that it hung in the air for a beat. Thorne and Croft exchanged a flicker of a glance, a micro-expression of confusion that Ilara caught and catalogued. What kind of a ridiculous, amateurish question is that? Thorne scoffed, but his bluster had a hollow ring to it. A simple one, Ilara pressed, her voice unwavering. The original document must exist for you to have scanned it. You or your experts would have examined it. Was it a ballpoint? A fountain pen? A felt tip? What color was the ink? Blue? Black? Julian Croft, the predator, the man who moved markets with a whisper, hesitated. It was only for a second, but in that room, under that pressure, a second was an eternity. He was searching a database in his mind that had no entry for this data point. He was a man who saw the grand architecture of a deal, not the bricks and mortar it was built with. He made a calculation. He chose the most elegant, most believable lie. It was a fountain pen, he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. A Schaefer. It was Eleanor's favorite. She used black ink, a classic choice for a classic woman. He even managed a small, nostalgic smile. It was a masterful performance. A Schaefer fountain pen, Ilara repeated, letting the words hang in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. Interesting. Arthur reached forward and pressed a button on the console embedded in the table. A large, high-definition screen descended silently from the ceiling, humming to life. As you all know, Arthur said, his voice now resonating with the old thunder of command that had built this company. I keep meticulous records. Every major document signed, every decision ratified in my presence since 1980 has been scanned and archived. This morning, my team located the minutes from the October 17th, 1995 board meeting, the very day that fraudulent codicil was supposedly signed. An image flared onto the screen. It was a scanned page of typed meeting minutes, clean and official. At the bottom were 2 signatures, Arthur Sterling and his CFO at the time, Richard Gable. As you can see, Arthur continued, Eleanor was not present at that meeting. She wasn't even on this continent. She was in Paris, accepting an award on behalf of her foundation. The screen changed, showing a crisp image of a newspaper clipping from Le Monde. There was Eleanor, radiant and smiling, holding a glass award. The date was clearly visible. A collective intake of breath swept around the table. The foundation of Croft's claim was cracking. But that, Ilara said, her voice dropping, drawing every eye back to her, is not the most interesting part. She took a slow step away from her chair, moving into the space between Arthur and the board. She felt their focus, a physical weight. Mr. Croft, you were so certain she used a Schaefer fountain pen. A detail so specific, so confident. It's the kind of detail you add to make a lie feel real. She looked from face to anxious face. What he couldn't have known, what only someone who truly saw Eleanor would know, is that she was left-handed. She let that fact settle. It was another brick pulled from the wall. As a left-handed person who loved the elegance of a fountain pen, she continued, her voice gaining a quiet, devastating power. She had one constant, frustrating problem. smudging. The wet ink would smear as her hand moved across the page. It drove her mad. So, in 1994, after a particularly messy incident involving a signed donor letter, she switched pens. For good. She fell in love with a new type of pen that had just come on the market, one with a revolutionary, fast-drying gel ink that wouldn't smudge. She turned her gaze back to Julian Croft. His face had gone from controlled confidence to a waxy, pale mask of shock. The blood had drained from it, leaving his skin taut over the bones. He looked like a marble statue of himself. She used a Uniball rollerball, black ink, always. She bought them by the box. She never, ever used a fountain pen again after 1994. Anyone who truly knew her, anyone who had worked with her, anyone who had seen her sign so much as a grocery list in the last year of her life would have known that. She paused, letting the silence stretch until it was screaming. Then she delivered the final, killing blow. The only person who would assume she used a fountain pen is someone who wasn't there. Someone working from an older, pre-1994 signature sample. Someone who was tracing it. The illusion did not just break, it shattered. The room was plunged into a profound, echoing silence. It wasn't the silence of contemplation, but the vacuum left behind by an explosion. Julian Croft stood frozen, not a predator anymore, but prey, caught in the blinding glare of a truth he had never anticipated. The carefully constructed edifice of his ambition, 2 years in the making, had been dismantled in 2 minutes by a detail he had considered utterly insignificant. Henderson, the audit chief, slammed a beefy fist on the granite table. The sound cracked like a gunshot. Fraud! My God, this is blatant criminal fraud! Get security, another board member yelled, fumbling for her phone. Call the authorities. But Julian Croft was already moving. The mask of civility didn't just fall away, it was ripped off, revealing the cornered, snarling animal beneath. A guttural sound of pure rage escaped his lips. He lunged, not for the door, but towards Ilara. It was a last, desperate act of violence, an attempt to physically extinguish the source of his humiliation. He never made it. Arthur Sterling, the 78-year-old man they had just tried to declare mentally unfit, moved with the speed of a lifetime of coiled fury. He shot out of his chair and met Croft's lunge, not with force, but with a solid, immovable presence. He grabbed the front of Croft's expensive t-shirt, his knuckles white. "You will not touch her," he snarled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble of protective rage. "You will not even breathe in her direction." Security guards burst into the room, their faces grim. They flanked Croft, who seemed to shrink under their presence, the fight draining out of him, replaced by the cold, stark terror of total ruin. Marcus Thorne, meanwhile, had gone from pale to translucent. He was already backing away, holding his hands up as if to ward off the disaster he had helped create. "I was misled," he stammered, his eyes wide with panic. "My client assured me I had no knowledge of any forgery." His desperate act of self-preservation was as pathetic as it was transparent. As security led a now limp Julian Croft from the room, followed by a babbling, terrified Thorne, the board members slowly rose to their feet. They turned, as one, to look at Ilara. The condescension, the judgment, the suspicion, it was all gone. In its place was a raw, unnerving mixture of awe and fear. They weren't looking at a waitress. They were looking at the woman who had seen a ghost in the machine of their billion-dollar world and had possessed the terrifying courage to tell them it wasn't real. The hours that followed were a blur of muted chaos. Federal investigators, sharp-suited men and women with cold eyes, had descended upon the tower. The Apex room was now a crime scene. The fallout was not a shockwave. It was a nuclear winter for Julian Croft and his empire. Elara and Arthur sat in the deep leather chairs of his penthouse office, a world away from the frantic energy downstairs. The city lights had begun to bloom across the Chicago skyline, a silent, glittering tapestry beyond the vast windows. On a television mounted on the wall, the volume muted. Images of Croft being led away in handcuffs played on a loop. It felt unreal, like a movie about someone else's life. The adrenaline had finally abandoned Elara, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Her body felt hollowed out, a fragile vessel that had held too much fear and fury for too long. She had stared down a monster and won, but she didn't feel triumphant. She just felt quiet. Arthur broke the long silence. He swirled the amber liquid in his heavy crystal tumbler. "I called Carlos at the Obsidian," he said, his voice raspy. "I told him you wouldn't be coming back for your shift." A familiar spike of anxiety, a ghost of her old life, pricked at her. You fired me?" He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw the full extent of the toll the last few days had taken on him. The lines around his eyes were deeper, but the storm in them had passed, leaving a calm, clear depth. "I accepted your resignation," he corrected gently. He reached into a drawer of his immense mahogany desk and pulled out a slim, elegant folder, sliding it across the polished surface toward her. "I'm an old man, Elara. My eyes aren't as sharp as they used to be. For 30 years, I've surrounded myself with people trained to see threats in spreadsheets and weaknesses in contracts. I forgot that the most dangerous lies aren't written in the fine print. They're hidden in the broad strokes, in the things you look at every day but no longer truly see." Her fingers trembled as she opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of heavy, watermarked paper. It was a letter of offer. The title wasn't for a consultant or an assistant. It was a position that hadn't existed an hour ago. Director of Special Projects and Legacy Initiatives, Sterling Innovations. The salary listed below it was a string of numbers that seemed to belong to another language, another reality. It wasn't a number that would solve her problems. It was a number that would obliterate the universe in which those problems had ever existed. It was the cost of her father's oxygen tanks for 1,000 lifetimes. It was the price of freedom. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes, blurring the impossible number. I don't have a degree," she whispered, the old insecurities a stubborn reflex. "I don't have any experience in whatever this is." "You have something far more valuable than an MBA, Arthur said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "You have clarity, and you have integrity that can't be bought. I can hire 100 men who know how to build a company. I need someone who knows how to preserve its soul." He rose stiffly from his chair and walked to the window, his back to her, looking out at the empire he had almost lost. This company was never just about making steel. It was about Eleanor, about building something that would last, something that would do good in this city, her foundation. It's been run by accountants for too long. They see grant applications, not human need. I want you to run it. I want you to use those eyes of yours to find the people who are invisible, the ones everyone else has stopped seeing. He turned back to her, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "And there's one more thing." He gestured to a large, sheet-draped object leaning against a bookshelf. "My assistant Helen is terrifyingly efficient. She brought this up from your apartment this afternoon." He pulled away the sheet. It was her easel, and on it her largest canvas, the half-finished charcoal portrait of her father. In the soft light of the office, The image was devastatingly powerful. The weariness of a life spent in darkness was etched into his face. But his eyes, the part she had labored over for weeks, held a profound, unbreakable dignity. It was a portrait not of a victim, but of a survivor. "The Art Institute of Chicago has a new endowment," Arthur said quietly. "The Eleanor Vance Sterling Grant for Continuing Artists. It provides full tuition, supplies, and living expenses for a student of exceptional promise who was forced to put their dreams on hold for the sake of their family. The selection committee was very impressed with the portfolio we submitted." He allowed himself a genuine, warm smile. "The first grant has just been awarded. It's yours if you want it. You can attend classes in the evening. You can work here during the day. You don't have to choose anymore, Ilara. You never should have had to." The dam broke. The tears she had been holding back for 2 long, suffocating years finally fell. They were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of a devastating, overwhelming gratitude. It was the release of a pressure she had forgotten was even there, the sudden, shocking lightness of a life unburdened. Later that night, long after she had left the silent tower, Ilara stood in the middle of her cramped studio apartment. The air smelled of turpentine, charcoal dust, and stale coffee, the scent of her real life. The formal suit Arthur's assistant had bought for her hung on the back of her door, an alien artifact from another world. The letter of offer lay on her small kitchen table, its impossible numbers glowing in the dim light. She didn't look at either of them. Instead, she walked to her easel. She picked up a stick of soft vine charcoal. The feel of it in her hand was an anchor, a homecoming. Its rough, dusty texture was more real to her than the crisp linen of the offer letter or the smooth wool of the suit. She looked at the portrait of her father, at the unfinished parts around his shoulders and hands. Her hand began to move. The sound of the charcoal whispering across the textured paper was the only sound in the room. It was a sound of creation, of truth-telling. She wasn't drawing a forgery. She wasn't deconstructing a lie. She was building a truth, giving form to love and hardship and resilience. The black dust coated her fingers, settling into the lines of her skin, a familiar, welcome stain. She was Ilara Vance, the director of special projects. She was the recipient of the Eleanor Vance Sterling Grant. She was the woman who had faced down titans in a glass tower. But here, in the quiet of her small room, with the dust of her craft on her hands, she was something more fundamental. She was an artist. She was the woman who truly saw, and she understood, with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that her work was just beginning.